Hi, I'm Shreya and this is Decoding Code. In this video, I will be talking about throwing exceptions and what exceptions are, and I will only be talking about throwing them and not catching them very in depth because I do already have a video on try, catch, finally statements. What is an exception? An exception is something that happens during the execution of your code that might disrupt the flow of your code. For example, if you are trying to divide by 0, that isn't possible. If you are trying to access something in an array that's actually out of the index or out of bounds, then that's not possible either. Or if you input something and try to put it into an integer, but it's actually you put in letters or something like that, that would also be an exception. And all of these things would disrupt the flow of your code, and it's not desirable. So those are exceptions. And for Java, exceptions are objects that wrap around errors in these methods. One of the ways to deal with exceptions are catching them in the method. So what you can do is you can just deal with it right then and there by putting whatever code that might cause an exception into a try statement or try block, and then you would catch it and put the exception that might happen, and then catch it and then do whatever you might need to do with it. And that's actually dealing with it up front and right there. However, you might not actually want to do that. So something that you might want to do, another way to deal with exceptions is to throw them. Now, throwing exceptions actually means that you are kind of throwing it up the call stack, so you don't have to deal with it right away. So you're basically saying that this error or exception can occur, and if it does, you can deal with it later. And basically, you would throw an exception whenever in the logic in your code something is undesirable or disrupts the flow of your code. I have this example here, and I have this just util class, and I'm trying to get an integer from the user, and here, right up front, I'm trying to catch it by asking for the number over and over again until I actually get an integer. So that's dealing with it very upfront. However, something that I also could do is I could just throw an exception here, and I could say if it is not an integer, I could just throw an exception. Later, when I'm actually calling the method, I can catch that exception and do whatever I want with it then. Because if I'm reusing this method for a lot of things, since it's a very generic method, I might be reusing it for a lot of things. And in those different situations, I might want to deal with it in different ways. So in this case, I can deal with it in those situations and while I'm calling the methods, and I don't have to just keep going through and asking for the number until I get the number. Like maybe I just want to cut off the code right there and tell them when I'm calling the method that, hey, if this exception was thrown, you didn't give me a number, sorry, that wasn't what I wanted. This basically makes your code cleaner, and also you can handle the errors however you might want to handle them in your actual code. Also, there's some of these exceptions you actually don't have to handle at all. You don't have to deal with them or catch them, and you can basically just ignore them. And those are called unchecked exceptions. Any errors or runtime exceptions are all unchecked. However, IO exceptions are checked, so you need to deal with them. So unchecked versus checked, you don't need to deal with them versus you are forced to deal with them. If you ignore the unchecked exception, it doesn't force you to handle it, it's fine. And if it's just kind of some side thing that you don't really need, and it's not very fundamental, then you can just ignore that and it will be completely fine. However, if you are using it in a part of your code that you need, or a method that you need to use and is very fundamental and important, then something that you would need to do is you would need to deal with that, however is good for that situation. Also, something to note is that exceptions are classes. So as you can see, you're importing this class exception, and then when you throw it, it would actually be throw new input mismatch exception. It's a new object of that exception class, which you're throwing. One other thing that is important for this to know is that you can also create your own exception classes, and how you do that is you just create a class, name it, and then whenever you want to throw that exception, you would create the object of the exception, just like something like an input mismatch exception, except with your own created exception. And you would want to create your own exception if, for example, if you had something that's a voting program, and if they input an age that is below 18, then you might want to throw an exception. And that isn't something that's already existing in Java, so you might need to create your own exception class in order to throw an exception when the age is below 18. And for any situation where something is undesirable or messes up with the flow of your program, it really depends on the situation and your project or your program or your code, and when you might want to create these exceptions. But basic ones are given by Java and are very useful. When you are making your own exception class, you need to either inherit from exception or runtime exception. Runtime exceptions, remember, are unchecked exceptions. So if you inherit from that class, then your exception will be unchecked. And then if you inherit from exception, then your class will be checked. The exception will be checked. The class exception inherits from the throwable class, which makes it throwable. And then if you have your own exception class that inherits from exception or runtime exception, then your class will also be throwable. And that's just the hierarchy. And a hierarchy of exceptions also exists in that runtime exception inherits from exception. And when you are throwing in exceptions or catching exceptions, in order to deal with it the best way possible, then you should probably put the exception the most specific as possible and not leave it too generic or general, because otherwise you might deal with it or catch an exception that you didn't think about, and then you would deal with it in a way that isn't specific to that exception that is actually being handled. That is everything basically on throwing exceptions. Hopefully this helped you, and if it did, then give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel down below. Comment down below any feedback and questions or questions that you guys might have for me. And I upload every single Monday. I hope to see you next Monday. Bye!